Some rules seem so set in stone that it's hard to imagine a time when they weren't in place, but hockey as we know it didn't come to exist until the early 2000s. The early hockey games looked much different from ours, but one thing was the same: they were always epic. Watch this video to know about the rule changes that made the game. First up, let's get things sorted. The National Hockey League was once the National Hockey Association. Their job was to make sure that the game was played fairly all around, but the meaning of fair changed over the years. The earliest records of ice hockey date back to 1910. This was the year that rules were formalized and the first ever rule change was recorded. Up until 1910, ice hockey was played in 2 halves of 30 minutes. From that year onwards, it was shortened to 2 20-minute halves. Eventually, it became 3 halves of 20 minutes, with 10 minutes in between each half. The teams also had to switch goals at every half. In 1912, they reduced the number of players from 7 to 6. A few years later, in 1918, they permitted goalies to fall on the ice while saving. Before this rule, they would be penalized if they fell. Okay, so far so good. All pretty no-brainer stuff, but we can't imagine hockey now with 7 players instead of 6. Then in 1921, they allowed goaltenders to pass the ball forward up to the blue line. Other than that, they decided that overtime would be limited to 20 minutes. Again, really tame rules, but we're surprised that it took them so long to devise them. We mean, shouldn't they have been a given? Other rules were more controversial though. Next up, gonna stay neutral. The neutral zone is as important to hockey as any game. It is the place where all attacks are launched and where extraordinary plays begin. But the NHL just couldn't decide how big they wanted the space to be, so they went over it a few times. The most major change was having a 40-foot neutral area at the center. Players could pass the puck forward and also kick it in this zone. The neutral zone is an area that has been changed over and over again. In 1926, the blue lines were repositioned to 60 feet from each goal line, making the neutral zone even bigger. Then again, in 1990, the neutral zone was reduced from 60 to 58 feet. But this isn't the end at all. In 2005, the NHL and the NHL Players Association signed a collective bargaining agreement that changed the region once again. Now, it was reduced from 60 to 50 feet. For once, they have to stick to it, and no changes have been made since then. Though nothing explains the constant back and forth of the neutral zone, especially the rules about what is permitted in the area. Forwarding passing was already permitted, but forward passing from defensive zones is also allowed if the other player is in the neutral zone. In short, they did everything they could to promote offensive play and even help the players out a little bit in defense. But the NHL loves to get into technicalities and ignore the obvious stuff though. Coming up, hey, that's a foul. Much of the drama in any sport comes from the fouls and penalties. The referee holds the power to make or break a team. As with any sport, hockey also has a lot of confusing rules around fouls. In 1918, they fleshed out penalty rules for the first time. For minor fouls, a substitute is not allowed for 3 minutes, nor major fouls, that time goes to 5 minutes. In the case of a match foul, there are no substitutes allowed for the remainder of the game. Ouch, that's harsh. But as always, they changed those rules a few times before landing on the current variation. Can you imagine that they established the penalty for a match foul, but forgot to define what the term meant in the first place? No thoughts, just vibes. In 1923, they finally defined it as actions that deliberately try to harm another player. They also said that a substitute could come in after 20 minutes in the case of such an event, but the player will be fined $50 and be out of the game. The player who caused the foul would also meet with the league later to discuss additional punishment. They're not taking this lightly at all. We can't imagine a time when these rules weren't the norm, where players could just foul and get away with it. Maybe the NHL isn't as bad as we thought. Also raise the offense. At some point, the NHL realized that to have an interesting game, teams should be allowed to have ample room to launch offenses, so they made a few rules to encourage offensive play. In 1961, they introduced penalty shots for fouls as well. The player against whom the foul was committed could take a penalty shot immediately after the foul. In this case, the player that committed the foul is the goaltender. Any player on his team can serve it instead. The NHL also introduced delayed penalty rules that stated 4 skaters must be on the ice at all times. Otherwise, the game just isn't fair. Also, no more than 2 players are allowed in the defensive zone since the puck has left it. The rest of the players must engage in some sort of offensive play. On top of that, in 1926, they allowed forward passes in defending and neutral zones for all players, and they made the goaltenders' pads 10 inches wide. At one point, the goaltenders' pads could be bigger than 12 inches. That would make it nearly impossible to score. Other than that, they also introduced penalty shots when a player is tripped and stopped from scoring. The shots were to be taken from a 10-feet circle that is 38 feet from the goal. The goaltender was not allowed to advance more than a foot from the goal to stop the shot. We mean, if it's extremely hard to score, no player would take the risk. All these rules made sure that they had a chance if they made the effort, not to mention the defense. But even then, a lot of the games ended with neither team scoring a goal, or both teams tying at the end. To make up for this, a bunch of overtime rules were instituted. In 1921, overtime was finally limited to 20 minutes, but this too would change multiple times over the years. In 1927, they said that there would be 10 minutes of sudden death overtime if both teams were tied at the end of regulation time. Then the very next year, they they changed it again. Now, 10 minutes of overtime were to be played without sudden death. If neither of the teams scored at the end, the match would be a draw. After the war, the rule changes continued. In 1947, the NHL said, you know what? All playoff games must end with a winner, so let's have two 10-minute extra time intervals. That seemed to become the norm for a while, until 1983 when the NHL added two 5-minute sudden death overtimes if the game was tied. Again in 1999, they amended the rule book. Now if a goal is scored in overtime, the winner is given 2 points, but the loser also gets 1 point. If no goal is scored in overtime, both teams get 1 point. In 2005, they decided that if no one scores in overtime, they'll have a shootout instead. Finally, in 2015, they also added that overtime will be played by 3 players, a goaltender only. Wow, that has more twists than a crime novel. It seems like the NHL has more mood swings than a teenage girl. Moving on, why can't we be friends? One of the biggest challenges the NHL faced was reducing fighting in the games. Players are all suited up, ready to fight for the puck, and sometimes they do. So how do you prevent war and promote friendly competition? Surprisingly, the first rule against this came all the way in 1976. We wonder how wild the games before that used to be. The new rule stated that any player who clearly instigates a fight will get a major game misconduct penalty. That remained unchanged until 2005. The collective bargaining agreement put player safety at the forefront and added things to curb fights. The instigator rule stated that any player that starts a fight in the final 5 minutes of the game will receive minor and major penalties, game misconduct, and a 1-game suspension. The suspension will double in the case of repeated offenses. On top of that, the player's coach will be fined $10,000 as well. Yikes. Now that's a high price to pay for a small punch, no? Though they haven't succeeded in eliminating fighting, it has definitely reduced over the years. So job well done, NHL? Or should we thank the NHLPA instead? Lastly, you can't do that anymore. The biggest of the changes is the limitation of moves that counts as a defensive play. Before, players could use these moves to hog the puck and slow the game. The CBA established a zero-tolerance policy on them that has now become the norm, and for good reason. The first thing they started penalizing players for was all obstruction penalties. That meant no boarding of players, so you couldn't trip, push, or check your opponent onto the boards. You also couldn't spear the other players with your stick. On top of that, you couldn't slash at other players with your stick, let alone raise your stick above knee level. Why did it take the NHL so long to be against these practices in the first place? We mean, shouldn't these be a given? Guess not for them. Players also couldn't interfere with their opponents, so using their body to block or pick was strictly out of the question. The same goes for holding. That is when a player either wraps their arms around a player or uses one arm to grab a player. Either of these can be done defensively and were considered major fouls now. The last thing to be prohibited was hooking. That's when you use the stick to restrain an opponent or the goalkeeper. Again, we'll say, who is confused about these? Like, obviously all of these shouldn't be allowed, but the NHL only got serious about them in 2005. Needless to say, the game was vastly different a few decades ago. These rules have made the game what it is today, and we can't imagine playing without them. That's it for today. Which rule surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We'll be back soon with another video.